When we start to read through the Old Testament, I think the theme that we need to be looking for is how the mission of God is being traced through, to see how God is bringing back a creation that is in rebellion to him, back to himself. It's important, therefore, that we begin, oddly enough, at Genesis chapter 1, not just because it's where we open up, but that's where the story as a whole begins. Doesn't mean you have to read the rest of the Old Testament cover to cover. There are a range of strategies you might follow, looking for chronological development or others, but cover to cover is also one that works quite well. But if you're reading in Genesis 1 and 2, we read the story of how God has created a world that is good, that is structured, that is ordered, a world that sings the praises of God. And in this world, we see that humans are given a place of special priority. In Genesis chapter 1, we see that humans are created in the image of God and are given authority to rule the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, the story is told from a very different direction, and we start with humans and we see how everything actually is created for humankind. But from that, we also understand that our rulership of creation is also a tending and a caring, which is the man's role in the garden. But Genesis 1 and 2 taken together, although in very different ways, are telling us that God has created a world that is good, that is ordered, that is blessed, and where we as humans are given a place of supreme importance within the purposes of God. All of that, of course, begins to unravel in Genesis chapter 3, where we have an encounter between the woman and a serpent. The man is actually present with the woman throughout, because when she takes the fruit, it's specifically said that he is with her. But the discussion between the woman and the serpent focuses upon the one thing that God has said they were not to do while they were in the garden, which was to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in the eating of that fruit, the eyes of the man and woman are opened, they see that they are both naked, and immediately they begin to make clothing for themselves. And in Genesis chapter 3, what we actually see is alienation beginning to develop. Alienation initially between the man and the woman, who are originally both in the image of God and as complements who complete one another. Now there is an alienation. No longer are they naked and not ashamed, but there is shame, and they are separated from one another. And that alienation becomes even clearer in the punishment statement that will be made, where God actually announces that there will be a conflict between man and woman for leadership, for rulership, in terms of sexual relationship and childbirth, but also more broadly. That's not to say it's what should be, it's what will be because of sin. There is this alienation that happens between man and woman. There's another alienation that happens between humankind and creation, so that where previously the garden had produced all that was necessary, now it's by the sweat of his brow that the man is able to produce his bread. Now it will produce weeds and thistles instead of that which was abundant and good. So there is an alienation between humans and creation. And of course there is alienation between humans and God. When Yahweh God comes for his walk through the garden and he calls out, the man and the woman attempt to hide themselves from God. Well, you can't do that terribly well. And they are confronted by God, and he asks them the questions that gradually draw out from them what they have done. But there is this alienation now that happens between them. And those three areas of alienation of humans with one another, alienations of humans with creation, alienation between humans and God, are actually the key themes that will run through the rest of the Old Testament, and indeed even the New Testament as well. We see those themes, though, then developing in the rest of Genesis chapters 4 to 11. The alienation between humans and one another, alienations between humans and creation, is immediately apparent in the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. Family relationships are breaking down. By the end of the murder of Abel by Cain, Yahweh is able to say that the blood of your brother cries out to me from the ground. And the creation itself continues to be damaged, while Cain, of course, continues to try and evade Yahweh's questions. And as we go through Genesis chapter 4, we see this increase in violence, so that by the end of the chapter we're introduced to a man by the name of Lamech, who celebrates his ability. He boasts of his ability. I've killed a man for wounding me. a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, which is Yahweh's protection upon Cain, then Lamech 77-fold. And he claims effectively the right of unlimited retribution and violence. And so Genesis 4 shows us how those areas of alienation, which we see in Genesis 3, immediately start to happen. That doesn't mean that God's purposes stop, because there is a genealogy. And I know that many modern readers find genealogies really hard to deal with, but the Old Testament has them there for a reason. And in Genesis 5, we have a genealogy of 10 generations from Adam through Seth to Noah. And the reason for that, of course, is that Noah is going to be incredibly important for what happens next. Because we have in Genesis 6 to 8 an account of the sons of God and the daughters of men, which is a very difficult passage to understand, but shows a breach in the order of creation, and ultimately then the flood, because the earth is filled with violence. And that violence, which we saw in Genesis 4, is the lead of the cause of the flood. And in Genesis 6 to 8, we have the flood story. And in the flood, we don't have actually a cheery animal story as they bounce up to an old man with his boat. We actually have the greatest judgment of God upon creation before the final judgment. And in this judgment, yes, God provides his grace because Noah finds favor in the eyes of the Lord. He is directed to build the ark, and God brings the animals to him. But as we go through Genesis 7 and we hear the story of the waters of the flood, what we actually see is that all the order of creation in Genesis 1 is progressively unwound. But in Genesis 8, we're told that Yahweh remembered Noah. And in the Old Testament, when we speak of Yahweh remembering someone, it's not a statement that says God has forgotten them and has now recalled them. Rather, it's a way of saying Yahweh is about to act favorably, graciously towards someone. And we see that then as the flood waters recede and Noah and his family eventually come to the dry land. Noah makes a sacrifice. And as a result of that sacrifice, Yahweh says in his heart that never again shall he curse all the earth. For as long as the earth exists, seed time and harvest, summer and winter, cold and heat will continue. But it's said in the context of knowing that the thought of humankind is evil from the youth up. So God knows that we live in a world that is in rebellion against him, but Yahweh will not destroy it. What's he going to do? Well, we see that beginning to be answered in Genesis chapter 9, where Yahweh enters into a covenant with creation. And a covenant is a very, very important theme for understanding the Old Testament. Some have even said it's the most important theme for understanding the Old Testament as a whole. Whether it is or not might be going a fraction too far. But if we see it within the context of what God is doing in his mission to creation, we see it in its proper place. Because there we have a covenant that God makes with all creation, in the knowledge that creation itself is in rebellion against him, that he will not destroy it, that he will keep it and he will protect it. Moreover, within that context, we have a reaffirmation of some key themes of creation. Humans are still in the image of God. We have not ceased to be in the image of God simply because of sin. But it's because we're in the image of God that there is a prohibition on murder. God commits himself in covenant. And so at the end of Genesis 9 and verse 17, we are left with a question. The earth is in rebellion against God, creation is in rebellion, and yet God will not destroy this creation. He is going to sustain it. How is that going to work out? Well, one of the interesting things that we find in the Old Testament is every time we have a covenant passage, a major covenant passage, we immediately have an account of sin. It's as if to remind ourselves that what we're particularly good at is staying in rebellion against God. And we see that in the second half of Genesis chapter 9, where Noah becomes drunk, and there is some action between his sons, which is not entirely clear, which leads to the cursing of Ham. And again in Genesis 11, we have the story of the tower and city of Babel, where the people wish to build a tower with its top in the heavens. But Yahweh has to come down to see what they have made. And they are scared of being scattered upon the earth. But Yahweh disperses them. So by the end of Genesis 11, we still haven't resolved the fundamental question. The earth is in rebellion against God. We see, in fact, how that rebellion continues, even though Yahweh has made this covenant in Genesis 9. What on earth, quite literally, is God doing about it? And the answer to that begins to be worked out for us in Genesis chapter 12 to 50. Again, we see Yahweh at work. How? Well, he calls a man by the name of Abram, who we know later as Abraham. And he promises to bless him. And he promises that in you shall all the clans of the earth find blessing. And the language of blessing is incredibly important because we saw blessing in Genesis 1. Yahweh blesses. It is the blessing of God that is sought. And the hope of blessing is going to happen through Abram and through him to all the clans of the earth. That is to say, God is in process of his mission of drawing a rebellious humanity back to himself within the context of his ultimate restoration of the whole of creation.